Hello again. Let me address the Battle of the Bulge now. Now, the number of questions here. Oh, there's a dang bug flying around me. There's a number of questions here that I want to address, and the first one is really the big one, and that is what significance the Battle of the Bulge had for Allied victory in World War II. Now, by December of 1944, the month the battle began, American and British forces were poised on the German frontier to begin their final assault into Germany. Now, on the other side of Germany, the Soviet Union, the forces of Soviet Russia, were also preparing to begin their final assault into Germany. And I can tell you that the Germans were very afraid of the Russians. The Russians had a massive military force with huge numbers of tanks and artillery, and the Germans had killed over 27 million Russians, or would kill approximately 27 million Russians during the war, many of whom were civilians. They had murdered millions of women and children, and the Russian soldiers wanted revenge in the worst way. Now, to put this in perspective, the Americans and British had probably 650,000 to 700,000 men killed in action or who died while on duty. The Soviet Union had about 6 million military deaths and 20 to 21 million civilian deaths. So the scale of the fighting in the East was tremendous. Now, Hitler believed if he could destroy the American and British armies along the German frontier, he could then use everything he had to stop the Russians, to delay the Russians, or perhaps even defeat them. And it's a little bit of a wishful thinking, because he's facing such an array of power, and American air power in particular is tremendous. American and British planes are bombing German cities on a daily basis, but Hitler's hope is that a surprise attack with the last of his reserves in the West, his last armor, his last troops, can destroy the American and British forces and allow him to focus on Russia. And boy, is he going to be mistaken. So Hitler's plan was referred to as, I'm trying to remember the name of the operation. Well, I can't remember, but it'll come to me in a minute. Wacht am Rhein, watch on the Rhine. The Rhine River being the river that divides France and Germany. Wacht am Rhein. So the idea was they would push the Americans and British back out of France, where they had landed on D-Day 6 months before. So the assault initially caught the Americans by surprise. It came almost exclusively into the American lines, and it really caught the Americans off guard. It caught us very off guard, and it actually came through a heavily forested area called the Ardennes Forest, and American officers did not believe that German troops could get through that forest with their tanks, but the Germans had knowledge of some very narrow forest roads that were covered by trees, and in some cases they sent their tanks single file through the forest to attack the Americans, and they punched a fairly deep hole into American lines. Now, fortunately, the Germans were short of fuel, and equally fortunately, one town held out. The town of it's spelled B-A-S-T-O-G-N-E, but it's pronounced Bastogne, like bass and tone. And that was where the 101st American Airborne were. Now, they were surrounded at Bastogne, but they also refused to surrender. They were led by a general named General McAuliffe, and a German party approached them for surrender, and McAuliffe used a slang word at that time, and the German translator said, "Hey, in the interest of humanity, you need to surrender or we're going to kill all of you." And so McAuliffe said, "Nuts." Now, that's kind of like saying, "Dang." Nobody says nuts anymore. But the German translator asked his American counterpart, "Can you translate what this means for us?" And the American translator said, "Yeah, it means you can go to hell." And so the Germans clearly took this to mean no, and the 101st continued to hold out in freezing, extremely cold weather and deep snow. They couldn't bury their dead. They just stacked them like frozen logs, and they held out. And Bastogne was extremely important because there were 5 significant roads that went through Bastogne. If you controlled the town, you could basically halt the advance of the German army or slow it down. Now the other issue was, because of the bad weather, the American and British Air Forces had not been able to use their fighter planes and bombers to stop the German assault. And the American Air Force and the British Air Force, or Royal Air Force, had a decisive advantage. They were dominant, but if the weather was bad, they couldn't do anything. So the Americans held out just long enough to get British General Montgomery's forces organized in the north and American General Patton's forces organized in the south, where they would attack from the north and south and cut off the German bulge that had been punched into the American line. Patton actually turned his army 90 degrees north. That is a very difficult thing to do, is to rearrange a whole army for a counterattack. And then, mercifully, the weather cleared and American fighter planes began to rampage over German forces and destroy their armor, shoot up their troops, and stop the attack. And then by late January, the bulge has been closed, it's been cut off. The German forces in that area have been spent, many of them have been captured, and the Americans and British will continue their attack into Germany in some of the most bitter fighting of the war. The Battle of the Bulge killed in 1 month about 19,000 American soldiers. It killed a lot of Americans. We had thousands more wounded and captured. So killed, wounded, and captured, the Americans lost, over 100,000, as did the Germans. But the Americans could take the losses. The Germans could not. And at the same time, Germany is on the road to defeat, because almost at exactly the same time, the Russians are beginning one of their final offensives to capture Berlin and to move deep into Germany. And in April of 1945, American and Russian forces meet on the Elbe River in central Germany, and they realize at that point that victory is certainly secure. Thank you.